Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Global Geopolitics, Saturday, July 18. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Here is something you would not notice from any single headline, but which sits underneath nearly all of them at once. Across the news of a single ordinary Saturday, the same quiet event keeps recurring. The boundary between the physical world and the deniable one is dissolving. And nobody has written the rules for what happens on the other side. Consider the pieces as they came in. A logistics center outside Moscow is struck by a drone. 7 night shift workers are killed while stacking pallets in the small hours. Not soldiers, warehouse staff. In Ukraine's frontline villages, food cannot reach people except by convoys that must, quite literally, outrun drones to deliver flour in the breadbasket of the world. The United States enters a 7th consecutive night of strikes on Iran, and the language coming out of Tehran shifts from negotiation to something more absolute, an official announcing that the policy of negotiating during war is simply over. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Silicon Valley, the fiercest argument in technology policy has collapsed onto 2 innocent-sounding words, AI safety, that now mean 4 incompatible things depending on who is speaking. What connects a drone over a Moscow warehouse to a semantic fight over the word safety? This, in each case, the old distinctions we relied upon to keep violence legible are being quietly voided, and the actors doing the voiding are betting that no one will hold them to account for it. The drone erases the distinction between combatant and night shift worker, because the machine does not see the difference and the operator is 1,000 miles away. The word safety, stretched to cover everything from a chatbot saying something rude to the extinction of the species, erases the distinction between a nuisance and a catastrophe, which is precisely what you want if you would rather not be regulated at all. Ambiguity, it turns out, is not a bug in the current geopolitical operating system. It is the feature. It is where power now lives. Watch how the domain has come to reward the deniable. A 7th night of bombing that degrades bridges and energy infrastructure and cuts water to villages in Iran's south. That is not a decisive blow. It is an open-ended condition, a war conducted in the passive voice. Kiev describes its strikes deep inside Russia as fair retribution. Moscow describes drones neutralized over the city, and somewhere beneath both framings, 7 people are dead and no one will ever be charged. This is the texture of conflict in this decade, not the clean rupture of a declaration of war, but a permanent grey weather in which strikes accumulate, attribution blurs, and escalation happens by increment until someone announces that negotiation is over and you realize the threshold was crossed several nights ago without ceremony. And here the argument I want to make over the next while begins to take shape. The state of the field is this, that the 20th century machinery for interpreting the world was built to read intentions and boundaries. Whose army crossed which line, who signed which treaty, what a word plainly meant. That machinery is now failing us across 3 fronts at once. The front of physical violence, where autonomous and remote systems sever the act from the actor. The front of language, where the terms we argue over have been deliberately hollowed so that any policy can be poured in. And the front of nature itself, which has stopped respecting the political map entirely. Do not let the wildfires slip past as mere weather. 800 fires burning across Canada, smoke drifting down to shroud Minnesota, Michigan, New York, threatening, of all things, the air over a World Cup final in New Jersey. France losing more forest to fire than at any point since the Second World War, the ancient woodland at Fontainebleau blackened. And the political response, a threat of additional tariffs and the assignment of blame to a neighbor's forest management. That is the tell. Confronted with a genuinely borderless phenomenon, smoke does not clear customs. The reflex is to reach for the oldest tool in the drawer and treat it as a dispute between 2 sovereign parties. It is a category error performed in real time, and it is going to be the defining error of the age. So the field, as it stands, is caught between the ambiguity it has learned to exploit and the ambiguity it cannot survive. The same fog that lets a state strike without owning the strike is the fog in which climate and machines and meaning itself now move faster than our institutions can track. Over the coming stretch, I want to pull these threads properly, to look first at how violence has been redesigned to be deniable, then at how our shared vocabulary is being captured word by word, and finally, at what it might take to build instruments that can read a world which no longer announces itself. But we begin here with the uncomfortable recognition that the confusion is not accidental. Somebody is benefiting from it. Let us find out who. If you were to glance at the surface of this particular day, you'd be forgiven for thinking the world was a scattered thing, a bit of everything, all at once. A World Cup final in New Jersey, the air over it thick with smoke drifting down from Canadian wildfires. A seventh consecutive night of American airstrikes on Iran, and villages in the south losing their water. Drones over Moscow, protests in Kiev, a new military barrier strangling the West Bank, a quibble in Washington over what the words AI safety ought to mean. It looks like noise. It looks like the ordinary chaos of a planet going about its business. But listen a little longer and you begin to hear something underneath. A deep current, moving slowly, indifferent to the headlines it happens to be carrying that afternoon. And the current, I'd suggest, is this: the steady erosion of the boundaries that used to keep things separate. The membranes are dissolving. What was once contained is now leaking into everything else. Consider the smoke. Fires burning in northern Ontario, and the consequence is hazardous air in Minnesota, in Michigan, in New York, and a genuine question about whether the players in an open-air stadium can breathe properly during the biggest match on Earth. There is something almost absurdly clarifying about that image. The forest fire does not respect the border. It does not ask which nation manages its woodland well or badly. And the political response, a threat of additional tariffs against the neighbor whose trees happen to catch, tells you that we are trying to fight a borderless problem with the tools of a bordered world. It doesn't fit. The category is wrong. And you'll notice the same wrongness of category showing up in France, where the government says the country has not seen so many fire outbreaks since the Second World War, and a heritage foundation is passing round a collection tin to replant a forest that took centuries to grow. We are learning, forest by forest, that the atmosphere is a single room and everyone is smoking in it. Now hold that thought against the strikes on Iran. 7 nights and the target list has widened: bridges, energy infrastructure, water. When you strike a power station or an aqueduct, you are not degrading an army. You are degrading a society's ability to be a society. And the retaliation lands not on the striker directly, but on a water and electricity plant in Kuwait, a neighbor, a bystander, a country whose only sin was proximity. The boundary between combatant and civilian, between the war and the region around the war, is dissolving in exactly the way the boundary between one nation's forest and another nation's lungs is dissolving. An Iranian official announces that the policy of negotiating during war is over. That, too, is a membrane collapsing the old civilized fiction that talking and fighting are separate rooms you can walk between. And here is where the deep current becomes something more than metaphor. Look at the erosion happening inside things, not just between them. In Washington, House members split almost exactly down the middle on whether to keep arming a longtime ally. A coalition that was, for decades, simply assumed, now visibly coming apart along generational and moral seams. In Kiev, crowds fill the streets not because the enemy has advanced, but because a popular minister was quietly dropped from the cabinet. The boundary between the war effort and domestic legitimacy no longer holding. Even the argument over artificial intelligence turns out to be a fight over a membrane. 2 words, AI safety, meaning wildly different things to different people, because the shared vocabulary that would let us reason together has itself begun to leak and blur. So what unites the smoke, the strikes, the split votes, and the contested words? They are all instances of the same structural fact. The 20th century was organized around containment, sovereign borders, defined enemies, agreed meanings, separate spheres. That architecture is not being attacked so much as it is quietly failing, the way a dam fails, not with a single dramatic breach, but with 1,000 small seepages until the whole face gives way. And notice what people reach for when the current pulls too hard. They reach for the World Cup. Kolkata singing for a footballer as though for a saint. Brooklyn's Little Palestine cheering for Spain. A stadium full of strangers agreeing, for 90 minutes, on the meaning of a single word, offside, and honoring it. It is not trivial that in a week of dissolving boundaries, the whole planet turns to a game whose entire beauty depends on lines being respected. The pitch is the last place where the membrane still holds, which tells you what we're really missing. Hold that in mind, because when we return, we'll ask the harder question, whether anything can be built to replace the boundaries that are washing away, or whether we simply learn to swim. So here we are, at the point where we stop describing the world and try to say what it portends. And the temptation, always, is to reach for the single grand narrative, the one thread that ties everything together. I'd resist that. What the week actually shows us is something subtler, and I think more useful, that the language we use to frame a problem has become the battlefield itself, and that the physical world keeps intruding on our tidy stories in ways we haven't learned to price. Start with that curious little dispute over two words, AI safety. Here is a phrase nobody could sensibly oppose. Who campaigns for danger? And yet it has fractured into rival meanings, each carrying an entire politics inside it. For one camp, it means the distant specter of machines that outthink us. For another, it means the mundane, immediate harms, bias, fraud, the erosion of a shared reality. And for a third, quietly, it has become a euphemism for regulation itself, a Trojan horse to be denounced. The second-order implication is what matters here. When a term becomes contested, the fight is no longer about the thing, it's about who gets to define the thing. Whoever captures the vocabulary captures the policy downstream, because legislators, journalists, and citizens all reason with the words they're handed. Watch then, for the moment a definition hardens into law, because that is when the abstract argument becomes concrete power, and by then the debate is usually over. That pattern-contested language, as a proxy for contested power, recurs elsewhere. Consider the near-even split among American legislators over military aid to a longtime ally. A vote like that, defeated but close, is not really about a single appropriation. It's a seismograph reading. It tells you the tectonic plates beneath a decades-old consensus are moving. The interesting question is never the outcome of one vote. It's the trend line the vote reveals. A coalition that used to be unanimous and is now divided is a coalition whose future is negotiable. And the parallel effort to shore up a reputation, to save an image in the public mind, tells you the same actors understand this perfectly well. Reputation management is what you do when the underlying consensus is no longer automatic. So watch the erosion, not the tally. Watch which arguments become sayable that were unsayable a year ago. Then there is the harder, blunter matter of the physical world refusing to cooperate with anyone's story. 7 consecutive nights of strikes, targets broadening from military assets to bridges and energy and water infrastructure that keeps ordinary people alive. When a campaign shifts from degrading an armed force to cutting water to villages, that is a strategic signal, and the signal is escalation with no obvious off-ramp. The stated position that negotiating during war is over closes a door. And here's the second-order concern. Escalation has a logic that outruns the intentions of those who begin it. Neighboring states hosting foreign bases become targets. A vital strait becomes a chessboard. The people who light these fires rarely control where the flames travel. And speaking of flames, the literal ones are perhaps the most honest teacher of the week. Hundreds of wildfires across one country, thousands of hectares lost in another, smoke drifting across borders and settling over cities that had nothing to do with the burning. The response to this, in one telling instance, was to blame the neighbor for poor forest management and to threaten tariffs. Now hold that image, because it's almost a perfect parable. Smoke does not carry a passport. Climate-driven catastrophe is the ultimate second-order phenomenon. It arrives from elsewhere, indifferent to sovereignty, and it forces us to answer whether we treat shared problems as shared or as someone else's fault to be punished. The instinct to reach for the tariff, to nationalize a borderless harm, is precisely the instinct that fails against a problem shaped like weather. Watch that reflex. It will define the coming decade more than any single summit. So what do we actually watch for going forward? 3 things. First, the capture of vocabulary, because whoever owns the words owns the argument before it begins. Second, the fracturing of old consensus, the close votes, the reputation campaigns, the arguments newly permitted. These are leading indicators, not lagging ones. And third, the collision between our political stories and the physical facts that ignore them, the fires, the quakes that draw down emergency funds, the smoke over a stadium where the world is about to gather to watch a game. That last image is worth sitting with. On one field, a contest with clear rules, a defined ending, a winner. All around it, smoke from fires nobody agreed to start. That, I think, is the shape of our moment, We have gotten very good at organizing the games and very poor at agreeing on the air. The signal ahead is not any one crisis. It's the widening gap between the neatness of our narratives and the messiness of the world they're meant to describe. Mind that gap. It's where the future is being decided. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.